Thank you so much for coming back on.
Thanks, Glenn.
So I guess one of the darker predictions of yours is that we are now well on our way to World War III. Um, I just wanted to ask why this is. What are you looking at? Is this possible triggers? Do you look at the chain reactions? Because, well, as we saw from the previous two world wars, one thing tends to lead to another, and one gets sucked in, and there doesn't seem to be a reverse button at any point. So, what is it that you're assessing?
Okay, so my first piece of evidence is the American National Security Strategy, which was just published 1 or 2 weeks ago, and it's very clear in that America, maybe 4 years ago, saw the world as possibly being organized and coordinated by multilateral organizations. What's important was for America to be the enforcer or the police officer to ensure that people abide by the rules-based international order. And in this document, Trump is very clear. This order has dissipated, it's gone. And so now that the only thing that matters is now national self-interest. So America needs to protect its own national self-interest. And that primarily means protecting the Western Hemisphere, what they call the Monroe Doctrine. There's something called a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which is to say that Trump will want to enforce the Monroe Doctrine. America believes that Russia and China have been encroaching too deeply into South America, especially China, which has a lot of trade investment agreements with South America to the benefit of the people there. But America has always believed that South America is American territory. And so now it will protect its territory. And that's why we are seeing the escalation in Venezuela. We're seeing 10% of America's naval assets consolidate in the Caribbean. And recently, there's been escalation. American forces have basically stolen a Venezuela oil tanker and diverted it to Houston, Texas. So America, by enforcing the Monroe Doctrine, this means that America will now come to conflict with entirety of South America, because when America is now threatening Venezuela, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, they all see their sovereignty being infringed upon. So that's one piece of evidence. The second piece of evidence is, of course, what's happening between Russia and Ukraine. This war between Russia and Ukraine is essentially over. Russia is dominating the battlefield. The morale in Ukraine has collapsed. There's about 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers who have deserted. There are millions who have fled abroad. So Ukraine doesn't have the manpower, nor the resources, nor the willpower to continue this fight. At the same time, the Europeans insist that the Ukrainians continue to fight. So there's talk among the Europeans of confiscating, stealing those 210 billion euros that it has from Russian assets and giving it directly to Ukraine. It's given up this idea because they understand it's suicidal, and so now they're about to give Ukraine 100 billion euros in loans and interest-free loans to continue this war. And the reason why is that Europe needs to enter this war at some point, and it's afraid that if there's a peace treaty, then Russia will be able to consolidate its gains and then use Ukrainian resources to challenge European supremacy. So that's the second major front. Then, of course, what we're seeing in the Middle East is a continuing escalation between Israel and Iran. So there was a peace treaty signed between Israel and different parties, Hamas, Hezbollah. It seems as though Israel has no respect for these treaties. It seems as though that Israel is planning to attack Hezbollah in Lebanon in the next 2 weeks. The Hamas peace treaty will not hold because Hamas will not agree to give up all its arms, because if it does so, then it will be wiped out by these Israeli proxies. So the Middle East will only flare up. There was this shooting in America of this nuclear physicist, and then there was this tragedy on Bonny Beach in Sydney in Australia where 16 people died, and Israel is pinning the blame on Iran with absolutely no evidence. There are these Mossad officers who've flown to Australia to participate in the investigation, and we can suspect that they will blame Iran in some way for what has happened. So all around the world, we're seeing the potential for massive flare-ups in 2026.
Well, it seems like one of the major things which are changing, which you suggested as well, is the change of the entire world order, though. But usually, a new world order would only consolidate itself after a world war. That is, if you have massive distribution of power, there's often little ability of the international system to reform itself. Usually, we need a big war, and then a new status quo can be cemented in agreements. But this is such a critical time, it seems, because the whole world order after the Cold War, again, has been based on hegemony, dominance, and now, of course, that distribution of power is gone. It is a multipolar distribution of power, so it's very or near impossible to transition peacefully, though, because the old war, which was based on U.S. primacy, now needs to find a whole new system on a balance of power. I mean, this changes absolutely everything. The rules of the games change, as you suggested. I mean, why the USS now China and Russia can't be in its backyard, but the US, of course, can still be in the backyard of Russia and China. So there's no acceptable rules. The institutions will change. The security, well, I mean, should it still be based only on deterrence and dominance? If there's now many centers of power, it doesn't really make sense. How diplomacy is conducted. I just feel like this is very difficult topics, but no one seemed willing to accept the reality or even discuss it. I mean, here in Europe, the overall sentiment or narrative is that all was well and peaceful, freedom and democracy was just spreading, and then evil showed up, and usually it has to be personified by Putin or a Xi Jinping, and it has to be confronted, must be destroyed, and then peace somehow can return. I mean, this is a very childish way of saying that they want hegemony back. And I guess I say childish because there's no strategy in terms of what they want to achieve, how they can achieve it, means that's required. It's just this emotional outburst and slogans about what is unjust. And as our hegemony was so virtuous, everyone was benefiting. But you see, this is a problem, the inability of our actual political leaders to address the critical time we're at, and why we need to essentially find a new status quo, or is it the inability to let go of hegemon? Is it just that the rules are changing? I mean, how can we explain this?
Yeah, I completely agree with your assessment. Before this idea of the liberal rules-based natural order, it's basically these Western nations bullying, exploiting, and colonizing the rest of the world. So for 20 years, NATO was expanding into Russian sphere of influence. And for 20 years, Putin has been warning NATO, you have to stop, otherwise we have to react. We have to protect our sovereignty. And NATO refused to listen. NATO was extremely arrogant, and that forces Putin's hand. Then China, for the longest time, was the basically the factory to the world. And China agreed to produce really cheap products to the world, which increased people's standard of living. And that made Western consumers really happy. But then came the 2009 financial crisis, when basically because of speculation, because of stupid policymaking, because of greed, the Western economy collapsed. And so what happened was that the Western central banks demand that China invest in infrastructure. And so for the next 10 years, China was digging itself into a hole with all this infrastructure spending. And eventually China decided we don't have enough resources to continue all this spending on infrastructure. And now the American economy has collapsed because the American consumers have maxed out their credit cards. The American consumers have been exploited for the past few decades, and they can no longer afford to spend any more money. So now what America demands is that Chinese consumers start spending money. Chinese consumers start maxing out their credit cards, and that China liberalize its financial markets. And China says, we will not surrender our sovereignty. And so China's being bullied by America. Under the first Trump administration, they started to levy all these tariffs on China. And it's continued under the Trump administration. And America insisted on all these bullying tactics, for example, denying trying to access to technology, to markets. A few years ago, the Huawei executive, Meng Wanzhou, she was arrested transiting in Vancouver, and she was put under detention for a number of years until she was finally let go. So, for the longest time, America and its allies were able to bully the world, and over time, Russia and China have stood up, and Europe and America don't like that, and that's the world we live in today.
Well, I feel like we watched this movie before to some extent, though. That is, before World War One, we saw with the rise of Germany that it effectively outgrew the British dominated system. So again, a shift of power. The British hegemon was declining. Germany as a regional power increased. So in 1871, for example, Britain produced twice as much steel as Germany, which was a good indicator of economic power. And 22 years later, by 1893, the German steel production had already then surpassed the British. And by the time World War One broke out in 1914, German steel production had doubled that of Britain. So that's a very short period of time for the whole relationship to be put on its head. Now, you can say power shifts up and down, but this is quite critical because the whole European security architecture then was still British dominated. So you have then Germany producing twice as much steel, yet all its major waterways, that is outside, internal in Germany, are patrolled and controlled by the British. It's it doesn't really make much sense. But it seems, after World War II, we saw the same. The Germans outgrew the the regional security architecture, and I was wondering, do you see this historical patterns? Because we have a similar thing now. I mean, the Chinese economy has been the biggest in the world in terms of purchasing power parity since 2014. While in Russia, we had after the Cold War, we decided let's develop a European security architecture where they wouldn't have a seat at the table because we thought they're weak. They're only going to get weaker. We're going to manage their decline. That would be the new Europe. So another Treaty of Versailles, essentially. So, but now we ended up in a situation where the Russians reversed, and now they have the largest state, the largest economy, territory, population, military. Yet they're supposed to be the only country in Europe which doesn't have a seat at the table. So all these red flags should be going up. I feel that this system is not going to produce stability but war. But yet again, we can't even discuss this. I mean, if you listen to the European politicians and their stenographers in the media, it's just, well, we have freedom and democracy, and Russia want empire, and then this is it. It's just a good old-fashioned good versus evil. I mean, it's quite extraordinary, but do you see historical continuity on some other levels?
Look, I mean, for the past 20 years, Great Britain has been the chief instigator of wars throughout the world. You go back to World War One, and one of the great injustices of that war was that Germany was forced to accept all guilt for causing the war, when in fact you could argue that Britain had more to do with the cause of World War One than Germany did. Okay, and the reason why is that Britain subscribes to an idea called the Mackinder Heartland thesis. And the idea is that Britain is a small country with very little manpower, but it controls the seas. So in order to maintain its hegemony, it needs to create as much chaos and conflict within the Eurasian continent as much as possible, because if a major power to arise in the Eurasian continent, whether it be France or the Ottoman Empire or Germany or Russia, then it would unite the Eurasian continent by railway, and it would negate sea trade. And so Britain would collapse economically, militarily, demographically. And so for the past 20 years, Britain has been sowing as much chaos as possible throughout the Eurasian continent. So you go back to the Napoleonic Wars, when Britain sponsored, financed 7 major wars against France. Napoleon had basically conquered the continent by the Battle of Austerlitz. Austria and Russia were soundly defeated, but Britain was still working behind the scenes, financing wars, because Britain could not afford for France to consolidate Europe and create a continental system, which is what Napoleon wanted. And then you fast forward to Germany in the same situation. So Britain cannot allow any power to emerge in Eurasia. And today, America subscribes to the same concept where, as you say, there's a parallel between what happened before World War I between Britain and Germany, and now between China and America, where China is a manufacturing superpower and it needs all these resources from South America. And South America has something called the lithium triangle, Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia. And that's about 50% of the world's lithium, which is crucial for EVs, for AI, for the future, basically. And so China's been invested heavily in South America, building roads, building infrastructure. There's this mega port that is building in Peru to facilitate trade. And South America has been very receptive and welcoming of Chinese investment. But America cannot allow China to continue to rise. And that's why America is going to use its sea power to disrupt global trade, right? So we've seen American troops boarding this Venezuelan oil tanker, but there was also this Chinese ship headed to Iran, and it was boarded as well. So this is just blatant piracy. America, for the past 50 years, says that we will defend global trade. And now America, in order to defend its empire, in order to weaken China and Russia, is now resorting to global piracy, basically.
What is interesting about the end of World War One, though, is every historian, well, more or less every historian recognizes that the Treaty of Versailles, put in place at the end of the war, set us on a path to a Second World War because it didn't create a sustainable place for Germany in the new Europe. However, if you would say that Germany was provoked to start World War II, then you're a Nazi sympathizer. So it's very strange because it's more or less the same thing. But I think it speaks to the mentality that if you recognize something, you acknowledge it, then you legitimize it. It just feels like we're a little bit back there at the moment because the Russian invasion, it couldn't possibly be more in the provoked. This was provoked in every way. But and you can easily prove this, but you're not allowed to say it because then you're legitimizing the invasion, and of course you have to be cancelled immediately. But I thought the Eurasian heartland comment was interesting, though. As you said, it derives to some extent from the Napoleonic system when they wanted to consolidate Europe, cut off the British as a maritime power, and then that would destroy them. So this kind of made the British convinced that you just have to keep the European powers divided. Of course, 120 years ago, this came into a more cohesive theory in terms of Mackinder. But in the 19th century, the British were fighting Russia as a potential hegemon of Eurasia. And in the 20th century, the American security strategists also referred to the heartland theory because they saw, they also saw them as the maritime power versus the Russian land power. But today, though, Eurasia is not hegemonic, and while the goal in the past was primarily to split the Russians from the Germans, always to push them out to Asia. This is why we did the Crimean War against the Russians as well in the mid-19th century. But now, when you push Russia into Asia, it doesn't push it into economic backwaters. It pushes it straight into the arms of the largest industrial power and technological power now in the world, which is China, at least one of the two. So it's a very different setting. So how do you assess this new Eurasia? I mean, one shouldn't overestimate the ability of them to harmonize their interests and work cohesively, but there is a commonality, though. The Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, I mean, Iranians, many of them have competing interests, but none of them wants to be dominated by a maritime power anymore. So how do you see this impacting, or does it impact this path to World War III?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. So, the Mackinder-Harlan thesis is something that's ascribed to both by the American Empire as well as the British Empire. And so what's happening is that because of American aggression, that because this system, this financial system where the US dollar is the world's reserve currency, which gives America exorbitant privilege, which is, say, you can print as $30 trillion and not have to suffer anything, and the rest of the world has to absorb this debt. It's driving the BRICS countries and Iran into each other's arms. So the great nightmare for the Anglo-American Empire is an alliance between Russia, Iran, and China. And of course, India will also come into this alliance eventually at some point because it benefits India. And this creates the Eurasian trade continental system. right? And Iran is the key because Iran's the pivot, it's the center of the world. All these trade alliances run through Iran. So the Europeans have something called EMAC, the European India Middle East corridor. Russia has something called the North-South corridor. China, of course, has a Belt and Road initiative. So Iran is the key. And that's why America is intent on regime change in Iran. Um, America cannot afford for this alliance to take shape, to manifest itself, because then America would lose trade access in the Eurasian continent. China, Russia, and Iran could just trade amongst themselves and then provide energy and food and manufactured goods to the Middle East, to Africa, to Europe. And then America just stuck with $38 trillion in debt, and the America Ponzi scheme would collapse. So for this is a this is a life and death struggle for America. So what it needs to do is go into Iran and make sure this alliance cannot take shape. It doesn't have to win the war, but it needs to create as much chaos as possible. And that's why I think in 2026, we'll see an escalation in rhetoric and conflict between America and Iran, with Israel as of course as the pit dog for the American empire.
It's funny when the complexity of this geopolitics has to be sold to the public. It's sold in the most absurd ways, such as, well, we want to have more women rights in Ukraine. Sorry, women rights in Iran. Like, this is apparently what drives the great power rivalry. But to what extent? Sorry.
No, I mean, like, you look at this Pawnee Beach tragedy where 16 people were killed. And we know that the person who committed the crime was an Islamic State sympathizer. And already they're pinning the blame on Iran. Why is Mossad involved in this single police investigation? I mean, it seems as though they're looking for every single pretext to create public anger at Iran.
Yeah. Well, a key problem as well, if you look at all of the previous two world wars, if you're going to look towards well, hopefully not the third one coming, uh, it's also been the assumption that the wars could be limited. Again, by definition, they had this chain reaction that, one thing led to another. I mean, I remember when at university when I was teaching causality. I would use World War One as an example. This leads to this. Nobody wanted to go down this path, but much of it seems to be based on the premise that they're able to limit the wars. In other words, it's this illusion of escalation control. We see some indications of this in Europe today. That is, the Europeans say, "Oh, we can send some troops to Ukraine." The idea is we can just tip the scales a bit towards Ukraine's favor to rebalance it and then stabilize the front lines so we can keep the war going. But it seems like the delusion, the fact that they will be able to control this, and somehow that the Russian responses to Europeans entering the battlefield, and then let's just contain the war to Ukraine and Russia. Europe should not be a part of this war. We're just sending troops and weapons and the targeting. But how do you see this in a wider historical context, and what we're seeing in the world today, though? I know that's a
Yeah,
very big
so
question. It's
look,
wide.
look. Yeah, I mean, but it's a common pattern in history where all wars started out as limited wars where one party is trying to achieve certain strategic objectives. And it always escalates into a full-scale war beyond anyone's control. Okay, there's the idea of mission creep. So think about Vietnam, where at first America was just sending in some advisors or trainers into Vietnam to bolster the South Vietnamese regime, and eventually it escalated to the point where, the entire American military was involved in a full-scale war in Vietnam. So I think one major flashpoint that we should look at is Venezuela, right? Because Trump is very clear. Trump is saying that, I'm not going to declare war. This is just a operation to destroy drug cartels. Because Maduro, he is a drug kingpin, and we will make sure we are trying to save as many American lives as possible. Okay, so that's just the rhetoric for public consumption. We all know that Venezuela has the world's largest proven oil reserves, and Trump is trying to make Venezuela into an economic vassal. Okay, so you would think that this war would be only limited to Venezuela and America, but this war has a potential to escalate very quickly because Cuba and Nicaragua would be on the next hit list after Venezuela. Also, if you're Brazil, you would think that the real target is you, because what happened was that before the trade war between China and America, America was providing China's soybeans. China imports a third of its food, and it used to get most of its soybeans from American farmers. And because of the trade war, China started to import soybeans from Brazil. And ever since then, the economic relationship between Brazil and China has only improved dramatically. And so China right now is Brazil's biggest trade partner, and this is true for every nation in South America. So if you're a South American nation, first of all, you're outraged at the fact that um, Trump is trying to conduct regime change in Venezuela. You don't like the Yankees. You've had this long history where the CIA plots coups in your nation, killing millions of people. You also want to maintain good trade relations with China because China actually puts real investment in your country. They build roads, they build good infrastructure, they contribute to the livelihood of your ordinary citizens. And America wants to take that away. So this war could escalate to a point where, okay, maybe American ground troops in Venezuela, but Brazil and other nations covertly send troops to reinforce the Venezuela regime because they know that if Venezuela falls, they all fall together. So it's a lake of gasoline right now.
Well, yeah, I think obviously the U.S. attempting to restore its dominance in Latin America, it fits within this shift of power as well because if it's a multipolar world, the main priority then should be that is there's a rival great powers. You want to control your own backyard, and of course, a lot of these countries have very bad history with the U.S. Well, dominating them, but so you can see how this could spiral out of control, and indeed why countries like China, Russia would want to at least defend their interest and relationships there. But do you see because you mentioned the possible war now against Iran as well to knock out this central piece in this new Eurasian constellation. But what is did you see this a similar path there in terms of that war spreading, getting out of control? Because whenever one wants to sell these wars, it's always so nice and limited. You know, we just want to get rid of a narco cartel. Everybody wins. It's a positive sum game. In the Middle East, it's we just want to deliver some freedoms and prevent them from getting nuclear weapons. Who would oppose us? This is by nature, if you want to sell a war, it has to be benign. So you don't see you delude yourself as to some extent in terms of where this is going to spiral out of control. But do you see other great powers or regional powers being pulled into an Iran war?
Well, I mean, the reality is that China gets most of its oil from the Middle East. So if there's a war, the Strait of Hormuz would be closed down. And that would create economic chaos throughout the world, especially Southeast Asia, which depend Korea, South Korea, Japan, and China, which depend on most of its oil from the Middle East. And Ukraine is not that far away. So, I mean, it's possible we have a domino effect where, I mean, I'm just hypothesizing, okay? I'm just showing you how all these things are interrelated. So, America is bogged down in Venezuela, and Israel attacks Iran. Iran, to defend its interests, will shut down the Strait of Hormuz. And then America will send in ground troops to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Russia helps Iran by pushing to Odessa, which forces the Europeans to defend Odessa. Basically, the European nations have to go full adult male conscription to defend Odessa. They don't have enough manpower as it is. Maybe Japan and China start to exchange heated rhetoric. Okay, so the world is interconnected, and it could be a situation where one flare up in one part of the world escalates to other parts of the world.